Your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people just like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. Back by popular demand, my guest today is Dr. Jen Howk. She actually was on a surprise bonus broadcast on Thursday, which I'll link to in the show notes, with Dr. Michael Greger from Hawaii, if you'd like to see that. And at the very end, I asked her a question that she knew was not going to be able to answer in 5 minutes. So she agreed to come back today to talk at length about this subject. And we're calling today Getting Past Your Past. And these ideas may not be popular with everyone, but I encourage you to listen to them with an open mind and see what Dr. Howk has to say. So when I've tried to help people with weight loss, when I used to do private coaching, most of them came to me and said that the reason that they were overweight today is because of something that happened in their long ago past. Often it was a trauma, physical, sexual, emotional abuse. And they cited that as the reason that they first became overweight and why it was so difficult to lose weight in their adulthood. And we hear this all the time. And we had a few questions that came in, and I'll read both questions now, and then I won't talk the rest of the broadcast, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Howk, and I know she has some slides, but I will reread the question that I asked, and then the new one that came in actually from a doctor about this subject. They're slightly different, but on the same topic. So Emily had said that in one of the healthy living videos that there was talk about how past trauma had nothing to do with emotional eating and is simply an excuse to be stuck in the pleasure trap. She was wondering how self-love comes into play here. If healing past traumas has nothing to do with getting out of the pleasure trap, why is it that when people make an effort to love themselves more, forgive themselves for past mistakes, and be kinder to themselves, that this often results in better motivation and therefore better self-control? Because for her, self-love often comes with confronting the past and setting the intention to let go of it, which relieves a lot of emotional pressure. And then I'll put my glasses on for this one. The question that was sent in by a doctor was saying that her mother and 3 of her sisters were all molested as children. Her mother also faced abusive caretakers who would chain the refrigerator so that she could not eat. My entire life, I have seen my mother and sisters battle with food. I suppose I just want to understand why that is. If I use the logic behind the pleasure trap and family habits, then it does make complete sense. I left that family in my 20s and vowed that I would never allow food to have that much power over me, but this doesn't mean that I didn't battle with other bad habits. And then she goes on to say that, would you mind asking Dr. Howk to address the Harvard study addressing adverse childhood experiences in particular that are linked to chronic health conditions? And they have all these things called the ACE, adverse childhood experience. When I was looking at the list, Dr. Howk, except for incarceration of a household member, I had like every single one of them. So I'm going to now turn it over to you, and please talk as long as you like about this important subject.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, I'm really glad to address this. This comes up all the time with, when I talk to clients, when I work with Dr. Lisle and he talks to clients. It's a common set of incomplete understandings about what it is that makes us who we are and why we struggle with the things that we struggle with, whether it's weight or anything else in life. And really, this is, we could go on about this for hours, and we actually do on our website. If people find themselves interested in this and they want like there's 4 hours of the background of the sort of the evolution of psychology and how it has these roots in Freudian ideas that have taken us really away from how things really work, and the behavioral genetics revolution, and why it's still sort of unappreciated and misunderstood and misapplied. So I can only get into like the very, very superficial top layer of this today. And I'm going to try my best not to take the entire hour, because I know people are going to have questions and I really want to try to address things. But that means I'm going to be covering a lot of ground really quickly. I often get criticized for speaking pretty fast, and that's a grad school legacy. When you go to grad school, you have to fight to get your ideas heard in a seminar. So I tend to do that. But you can always slow down the recording and repeat things, and reach out to me and ask any questions to clarify, because I just want to sort of give people an overview of what it is that really makes you who you are, and where trauma fits into that, and where, if you have a high ACE score, as I do, I have quite a high ACE score, as most people in my family do, what that really means, and the difference between correlation and causation, and just a bunch of different things. So I'm gonna try to get some of these slides to play to walk us through this, and let's see if the technology gods are with us today. share the screen. Good, it says unknown. Let's see if that works. Oh, yeah, of course I'm gonna have a glitch. It's asking me to change my preferences. Let me check Zoom.
Okay, you are worth waiting for.
Oh, yeah.
Appreciate you being here.
It looks like I might actually have to quit Zoom and come back. Is that gonna screw us up? Can you keep recording?
I don't think it will, you never know. So
yeah.
I mean, I know that people have been knocked off Zoom and they come back. So yeah, we can certainly try. I certainly can't address this topic, but I can entertain the troops while you're
okay. Gone. Entertain. I'll quit and come right back. I'll click the same link. I think I need to give it permission to share. So okay, this is what happens when we don't test it ahead of time. We should. That's true. Okay. We've just figured okay. I'll be right back. And if it doesn't work, then I can just talk about it. So
okay, great. Okay. All right. So here I am. Back. You're back already?
Nope. I'll be right back.
So, hey, everybody. Hey, we have some superstars watching today. You know who you are, and you're all superstars in my opinion. So I didn't expect to be on alone. So let's see. I'll tell you who's up for the week. That's a great idea. Here, I've got a great week coming up. Why don't I tell you guys now? If you're on my mailing list, you get an email every few days. We try not to do every day, but 2 or 3 times a week to tell you who the guests are. So tomorrow we have Dr. Doug Lisle. It is totally a coincidence that they're back to back again. We didn't plan it. They just looked at their schedule. Next month they come back together. Oh, she's coming back.
Okay, let's hope that worked. I think it's because it's recording, so I had to give it permission to record. All right, let's see.
Yay!
All right, did that work? Can you see my?
I can. Yes, perfect.
Okay. All right. So this title that I gave this today is Getting Past Your Past, Why Your Childhood Adversity is Not Why You Were Overweight / Underweight / Alcoholic / Depressed / Underemployed / Overstressed / Divorced / Anxious / Successful / Miserable / or anything else. And anybody who's a big fan of the movie Office Space, as I am, will recognize Milton down there being all upset that he was told there would be a sense of accomplishment. And that things, he could have been somebody, things haven't gone the way that he wanted. Okay, so like I said, this is going to be an absolute whirlwind tour through a whole lot of information, but we're going to cover as much ground as we can here. So the fundamental question that we're really beginning from today is what makes us who we are? If you are an adult who is struggling with your weight, you're struggling with keeping a relationship, you're struggling with holding down a job, why is it that you have these issues? And we are rooted in a paradigm that was established in the late 19th century by this guy. This is of course Sigmund Freud. And his ideas that he came up with at that time really continue to inform contemporary psychological thinking. And I do want to just stress for people who are watching this who don't know who I am or aren't familiar with what I've talked about, I am not a clinical psychologist. I am not out here, giving you advice as a clinical psychologist. My PhD is in social science and political science specifically, and this is all my independent research into these questions and my sort of intersection with them through my social science work. So, Dr. Lisle is a clinical psychologist, and you can always speak to him if you have specific questions about that. My work is as a coach with these principles, but I like to take pains because sometimes people get confused and get upset that I'm calling myself a psychologist, and I really am not. But I do want to critique the field from where I sit in the research that I've done. So you'll recognize Dr. Phil here. Dr. Phil is sort of a modern day Freud. The basic idea of Freud, if anybody has ever been to a therapist, usually the experience that most people have in the therapeutic environment and the way that it has emerged into our culture and all the self-help industry is this kind of tell me about your childhood kind of paradigm. Like what went wrong in your childhood to derail you from who you could have been and gave you the baggage that you have today. This is just such a common idea that it really represents the conventional wisdom of how we approach the issues that we have as adults. And Dr. Lisle and I call this the bruised banana theory. So I put the banana next to Dr. Phil because these are basically the same kind of thing, that you were in principle this unblemished banana, and bad things happened to you and permanently bruised you, and now you're damaged. And if only those things hadn't happened, that you would have been a different kind of banana. You would have been just fine. And it's the issues that it's the circumstances of your early life that took you off of that path. And this kind of thinking has its origins in Freud. Freud, in his clinical work, very long ago, started to identify these concepts, and we explain all of this sort of the lineage of this thinking in our 4-hour human nature series on our website, esteemdynamics.com. But for the purposes of this talk, Freud's ideas got a big boost from the ideas of learning theory and the work of conditioning that Pavlov did with dogs. People have heard about how Pavlov had these dogs that would drool. They would anticipate their food coming when they learned to associate it with the sound of a bell ringing. So this kind of idea that we could shape behavior with with training and these cues and link these kind of things together became this very intuitive notion of who we become as adults, that we become, in the words of many psychologists, including Dr. Phil, the sum total of our experiences. This is a very intuitive notion of what shapes us and what gives us the issues that we have. So this is, I love this cartoon. I know he cheated on me because of his childhood abuse, but I shot him because of mine, this guy says in the courtroom. So this is kind of everybody has these experiences. They give us our adult issues. They shape the way that we see the world and are really responsible for how we behave. Almost everybody believes that this is true. It's intuitive. It has been repeated by over a century of work in the self-help and personal development arena. And it continues to be really ascendant in the work of people like Dr. Phil and other people who work in this space. So it's all very intuitive. It seems very plausible that this is what would make us who we are, but it turns out that it is really just fundamentally not true. So this is a photo of a fellow named Robert Plomin, who wrote a book called Blueprint in 2018 that Dr. Lisle and I will talk about a lot on our website and on our podcast, Beat Your Genes. Robert Plomin is one of the founding researchers in, I don't have time to get into all of it today, but these monozygotic twin studies that began in the 1980s, where if we really want to understand where people's personality comes from and where their issues come from, one of the most robust and powerful ways to do that is to essentially control for genes by taking identical twins who were raised in different environments, separated at birth and raised in very different families, and find out how similar are those twins as they grow up, despite the fact that they have very different childhood experiences. And from now decades of this identical twin research that has been replicated again and again, and there are over 15 million pairs that have been studied now, we know, this is really established, that the nature-nurture debate is actually very settled in the science. It is nature, it is not nurture, that these twins, despite the fact that you raise them in very, very different environments, and some have traumatic experiences and others don't, some are given every advantage and others aren't, that over time, the twins really converge on similar measures of everything that you could look at, from personality to educational attainment to successful marriage. And then of course, all the other fun little things that you find that twins share when they meet each other after being separated, where they drive the same car and their house is the same color and their wife has the same name, and all of these really interesting little traits. So we know from the twin studies, and Plomin really was one of he was a founding member of the cohort that devised those twin studies, corroborated later by adoption studies as well. And he is a behavioral geneticist and psychologist who lives in the UK now. He trained at the University of Texas. So his book Blueprint is kind of we think, Dr. Lisle and I really look at Plomin sort of as the McDougall of behavioral genetics. He is decades ahead of his time. He has been telling us how this really is since the 1980s. And in psychology as a discipline, and everybody in the dietary and self-help arena has just been systematically ignoring this information because it's a little uncomfortable and because it's not very compatible with what they're trying to sell you, essentially. But Plomin is really, this is the truth of how it works. So this quote is from Blueprint, and this gives us some context for what we're dealing with. He says, genetic research has shown that environmental influences are idiosyncratic, stochastic, and unsystematic. In a word, random. Our experiences matter, but they do not fundamentally change who we are. We would essentially be the same person if we were cloned and our clone grew up in a different family, went to a different school, and had different friends. Okay, so that sounds pretty dramatic, right? This is almost a sort of genetic determinism that you're going to be exactly the same person if you share genes with them. So it's more nuanced than that, and we're going to talk about a little bit of that. But the idea that what I want people to focus on is that the environmental influences are idiosyncratic, they're unsystematic. Those environmental influences are the non-genetic components of who it is that you are. They are the things that happen to you, and this includes things that are going to drive up your ACE score, the adversity that you faced in your childhood, the traumatic events. That is part of the environment, part of the nurture effect that is creating who you are. But that is not having systematic effects on your life over time. It has passing, unsystematic, ephemeral effects. It can change your perception of how to live your life in the moment, but it doesn't permanently change your personality. So this is it's a subtle point, but I really want to try to drive this home to help people understand it. We're going to get more into this. So this is a very stylized, extremely scientific pie chart. I put this together to kind of give people a sense of what most of the behavioral genetics literature is converging on as far as any given trait that we could measure and what creates the expression of that trait. So this is a topic called heritability. So heritability is a precise term that is really talking about what percentage of the variation in the population is explained by genetic variation. And heritability is slippery, and it can change over time, and it's subject to a lot of different ideas, but this is the basic notion here. So most traits, whether it is a personality trait or something like obesity or something like your likelihood to get divorced, they converge around 50% straight up genetic. We can just trace that the heritability of that trait is very clearly usually somewhere between 30 and 70% genes. So this little stylized pie is just sort of on average, we're going to say that most traits are 50% heritable. Some are much more, some are a little less. The rest of that, this is where people kind of go awry. They're like, oh, well, if it's 50% genes, that means the other 50% is nurture. And so I have lots of control over how my children turn out. And conversely, my childhood had 50% influence on how I turned out. But that's not what this means, because the only piece of this pie that is really your childhood or the parenting that you were exposed to, or the sort of systematic shared, what's called the shared environment, is the little yellow section, the little nurture section. It's a very, very, very small piece of the pie. The rest of it is these chance events, the ephemeral non-shared events that Plomin is talking about. Which can include traumatic events, but this is everything. This is everything over the course of your life, and any particular event or any particular non-shared characteristic, usually in most of these studies, it explains 1 or 2% of the variance in the distribution of the trait. So even if it seems very extreme in your narrative history, when we actually look at it and we control it over the population and we try to figure out how much of the variation in obesity is being explained by something like childhood trauma, it's maybe 1 or 2% of the variance. And the rest of that variance of something like obesity is between 70 and 80% genetic. So this is, and then the rest is all the other little things that add up that are uncontrollable, random, and don't have long-term effects. So this is really how people need to be thinking about this, that it's much more the determining course that your childhood puts you on is much, much, much smaller than we have an intuition that it's going to be. So this is just some sort of, just to give people a notion of the general heritability of various things that we think about. So if eye color were 100% heritable, there would be no effect of the environment or anything that happened to you as far as what kind of nutrition you had, what kind of trauma you were exposed to, anything early in life or later in life that could change your eye color. And of course, things can change your eye color. Stress, intense childhood stress, malnutrition, all these things could affect eye color or height. Height is only 80% heritable. So there are these influences that can change these outcomes, but there's a lot of genes in the mix here. So we've got weight usually is put at 70% heritable. Something like autism, 70%. School achievement, how well any given child does in school, the level of education that they attain, 60% heritable. And then something like breast cancer, 10% heritable. So people often have a sense they kind of get these backwards. They think that the most heritable things are not heritable and that the least are very heritable. So this is just to give people a little context for that. Okay, so this is, we're moving into a real big principle in science, which is that correlation does not equal causation. People may have heard this before, but may not have a sense of what it really means. And this is why responding in particular to the ACE scores and to the way that people kind of put together things, it seems like the things that happened in my past seem to have had, it just seems logical that they would have this influence on how things turn out in the present or the future. It seems this is very plausible. We've got lots of observational evidence that seems to corroborate it, but we are falling into this correlation causation error. This cartoon kind of illustrates how we can get into this mistake. So this guy's looking at this data pattern saying, everybody who went to the moon has eaten chicken. And this other guy says, oh my God, that's such a strong correlation that, good grief, chicken makes you go to the moon. When obviously this is funny, it's a joke, because clearly there's something else that is driving this data pattern. It's not the fact that these people have eaten chicken that makes them likely to go to the moon. It's that they are adults who grew up in a certain period of history at a certain level of socioeconomic status and had access to chicken. That it's like, there are all kinds of different ways we could explain this. So this is a correlation. That you have the same value that moves in tandem with each other, but it's not, one is not causing the other. So when we observe that things seem to happen in this kind of relationship, we just, as humans, we're pattern detectors. We're always trying to come up with a story to explain what we're looking at. It's part of what's made us very successful throughout our evolutionary history. So we're very quick to assume causal relationships when it seems like a change in one thing like looks to move at the same time as a change in another thing. So these are usually, often these assumptions of causality are correct. When we see things arising together, there very often is a causal connection, and our ability to infer that pattern is part of what has made us very successful as a species. It helps guide our decision making. Our brains are essentially, Dr. Lisle and I often will call us correlation machines. That's how we decide what is the next best thing to do. We look at our past experience and whether something was successful before, whether it led us to an outcome that we desired, it's likely that it's going to do that again. We are inferring causation between things that occurred in tandem before. And that's a really useful guiding principle to help us make better decisions as we go throughout life. This is subject to error, however. So even though it's correct a lot of the time, it's not always correct. So some of the ways that it is correct, clouds cause rain. We see, when it starts to get cloudy, rain seems more likely. So we put that together and there seems to be a causal relationship there. Okay, it's pretty plausible. Moldy food is gonna make me sick, gonna cause digestive distress. That's a very good correlation that we came up with in our natural history to keep us away from eating food that was going to make us sick. Being late for work, it's going to upset your boss. It's going to cause job insecurity. Another correlation, these things seem to go together. One seems to cause the other, and it's more or less correct. There's nothing other than that, what we call the independent variable that is having the effect on the dependent variable. Okay, but this is not always so cut and dried. So sometimes our intuition that one thing is causing the other is actually incorrect. So just because two things are correlated, this co-related, they're related to each other, that one is not necessarily causing the other. And usually this is because there's a hidden variable. There's a third variable that is actually causing the change in both of the two things that you're looking at. So sometimes the third variable is very obvious. You know, we look at something and we see that there's a correlation, but clearly they're not causing each other. So there's a correlation between higher ice cream sales in a given city and more crime. But nobody thinks that, you know, the fact that there's more ice cream being eaten is what's causing the crime. So you see the increase in both at the same time, but nobody thinks that those two things have a causal relationship, because that just doesn't pass the intuitive smell test. So there's a third variable, warmer weather, that is driving both of those things to go up at the same time. You have warmer weather, people want ice cream. Warmer weather also causes people to be out in the streets, not at home as much. There's some evidence that it increases people's propensity to sort of criminal behavior and anger and all kinds of things. So there's all sorts of literature about this, but whatever it is, we clearly can say that it's not ice cream that is causing the crime. Another really common one that you'll see is there's a very strong correlation between shoe size and reading comprehension, but nobody would say, oh, you know, the shoe size is having this determinate effect on reading comprehension. Of course not. There's a third variable that is age. The older you are, the bigger your shoe size, the more likely you are to have higher reading comprehension. So this is sort of just a way that these things can arise, and we intuitively are able to rule out the fact that they have a causal relationship. This little cartoon with our crazy girl with the knives. I like knives because I wasn't allowed to use the stove as a child. Maybe you weren't allowed to use the stove as a child because you weren't safe around the stove and you're not safe around knives. So this is how this sort of thing works. Okay, so this is how conventional wisdom can get derailed and confuse us. So we make these correlational observations, which lead to these intuitive hypotheses about the world. And those unchallenged become how we see the world working, even though it's really not correct because there is another variable. And this is particularly true when we're dealing with difficult or taboo or these tricky sensitive topics. So the following statements are these are based on correlational observations. We seem to see these things arising together, and it seems like they have a causal relationship, but they haven't been, we're not, that intuitive relationship we're inferring has not been subjected to really intense analysis that controls particularly for genetic factors. So exposure to more significant trauma makes you more likely to develop PTSD. That would be sort of an intuitive assumption that most people would think is, as those things go together, those things are true. People who experience trauma in childhood are more likely to become obese or more likely to develop alcoholism or more likely to have later in life health consequences. This is the core assumption and the finding of the question that you were asking about, the ACE study, the Harvard ACE study. This is a correlation. We observe that this is true, that the people who do have those adult issues are more likely to report childhood adversity. So that seems like these have a causal relationship. One is causing the other. The same as children who experience higher ACE scores, more adversity, are less likely to graduate from college. So these observations are not, these correlations are not untrue. They are true. We see them repeated over and over again in the data. They do go together, but that doesn't mean that one is causing the other, because we are missing this third variable. We are missing genetics. We are looking at these correlations without actually putting them through a rigorous controlled analysis that controls for genetic influence. So anyone who has read, this is the dog that didn't bark in the nighttime, Silver Blaze, the Sherlock Holmes story. This is the Scotland Yard detective asks Sherlock, is there any other point to which you would wish to draw my attention? And Holmes says, yes, to the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. And Gregory says, but the dog did nothing in the nighttime. And Holmes says, that was the curious incident. So the fact that the dog did not bark is the clue that Holmes needs to get insight into this mystery, that the story as it was told you know, someone breaking in could not be true, because the dog would have barked at a stranger, but it would not have barked at someone that he knew. So the fact that there was not a bark is actually the clue that takes us to the truth. So what is missing from our analysis of these causal relationships between these things? And there's a lot of text, and I'm going to just go through a bunch of information here. And this is where I know I'm giving you way too much, but I want to get people started on this if they're interested in it. So just diving into these assumptions. So something like exposure to more significant trauma makes you more likely to develop PTSD. Well, let's question that a little bit. So we know from twin studies that have been replicated over and over again that the general estimated variance, the heritability of exposure to what's called high risk trauma. So a lot of this literature comes from the combat literature. So people who volunteer, who find themselves in combat situations in war, that's high risk trauma. So 60% of that is heritable. So we can explain 60% of the variance in people who are seeking to be in a situation that is going to potentially involve high risk trauma is attributable to genes. And a lot of that is the personality of the parents. A lot of it is being traced through your propensity to put yourself in a dangerous situation. And these are things that just are not usually addressed in this way in the more conventional self-help literature. 46% of PTSD is also heritable. So there's a genetic, your likelihood to develop PTSD is not purely related to the event. It's related to the kind of way that you were wired and how likely you are to show that those symptoms that we would give the name PTSD, but it's not, there's the causal relationship is not the way that we're thinking about it. And you can get an intuition for this if you think about how some people go through really, really, really horrific events and do not develop PTSD, and other people go through other events that would not create long-lasting problems for other people, and they are really derailed by them. So clearly there's something else going on other than the intensity of the event itself. The same event, we can't say that the same event is equally traumatic for everybody in the population. There's variation, and that means that we have variation in our susceptibility to it. So we also know that there's an extremely high degree of genetic overlap between the same genes that make you more likely to be exposed to high risk trauma and the genes that make you more likely to show the symptoms of PTSD. So that means this, in other words, some of the same genes are driving both the tendency to seek and engage in high risk behaviors, such as combat experience, and to exhibit those symptoms. So this is the dog that didn't bark. That's the same. You've got a shared genetic driver that is leading to both of those things. One is not causing the other, not entirely. So and this is a point that Plomin makes over and over in Blueprint and elsewhere. He calls this the nature of nurture. So the circumstances and even the events of your life are not random. You're seeking through your personality, through who it is that you are, through where you feel comfortable, through what excites you, through what attracts you. You seek certain environments and experiences in part because of your personality, which can include an attraction to adrenaline producing high risk behavior, which makes you more likely to experience a traumatic event. So in the case of combat veterans, which is where most of this literature comes from, the data suggests that some of those same genes that attract those people to dangerous situations are also likely to make those same people more susceptible to the expression of post-traumatic stress syndrome. So this is why this is a very complex thing. And I know that this particular example doesn't have anything to do with emotional eating or obesity, but it's giving you an insight into some of the literature that does exist that complicates these notions of correlation being the same as causation in this kind of example. Okay, so here is a little more relevant of an example. So women who experience childhood sexual assault are more likely to be obese and or alcoholic. You'll see claims and assumptions that both of these are true. So there's not as much research into this, but there's some. We know that there's one really robust meta-analysis that happened in 2010 that finds that both genes and the shared family environment affect childhood obesity, but that environmental effect actually disappears by the time that child is about 14. So this is then another nuanced point that yes, the what kind of family you grow up in, what kind of food you're eating, what kind of rules you have around food, how active you are, that has a big effect on whether you're overweight as a child, but it loses that effect as you grow older. So the heritability of obesity actually increases as we get older. The environment has a bigger effect when we're kids than it does when we're adults. By the time people are 40, they're basically the heritability of how obese they are is almost entirely attributable to genes because their parents aren't telling them what to eat. There's nobody buying their food for them and creating rules around it. When as a child, there is, so the environment has a bigger effect. But that effect washes out over time. When Plomin talks about these things being unsystematic and random and stochastic, that's what he means. It's the washing out of the effect as we age and we essentially become more who we are over time. Another just a sort of way to think about why this is maybe not as causally true as we would infer that it is when you look at the fact that 82% of childhood sexual abuse victims are female. Most CSA victims are girls, but adult obesity is distributed pretty equally across the gender spectrum. So you don't have 82%. It doesn't translate to 82% of obese people are females. It's more 50-50. And actually in some cases, there's a slight skew to more males. At the same time, men are twice as likely to meet diagnostic criteria for alcohol abuse. So if it was driving really simply, if a traumatic childhood experience was singularly driving either of those outcomes, you would see more of a proportional representation in the outcome, and you don't. You see sort of a mixed result. So what's going on there? Are women who were abused more likely to be obese and men are likely to be alcoholic? Well, why wouldn't they be the same? Why would it split along gender differences in that way? This is another case of the dog that didn't bark. There are genetic factors here that are not being accounted for when people make these inferences. So something like childhood sexual assault, it fits into the random, non-shared, non-systematic environment section of the pie chart. It has an effect, but the effect is very, very, very small. It's 1 to 2, maybe 3% of the ultimate variance when you look across the population. So people hang their hats on the fact that something bad happened to them, and they're inferring that that is the entire environmental causality of who it is that they are, when really it's only explaining a very, very small percentage of it. And it doesn't persist over time. So, and then finally, the other example here, children who experience more adversity and have higher ACE scores are less likely to ultimately graduate from college. Well, this is, again, we know that 60% of school achievement is heritable. And the other 40% is really random chance. It's not the shared environment of what you were subjected to consistently that you would share with a sibling. It's the chance events. It's the teacher who took a particular liking to you and helped you with your college applications. These things that are beyond our control as a family. So Plomin, again, he makes this, he really wants to remind us that the key environmental piece of making us who we are is down to chance, to unpredictable events. He calls this sort of a gloomy result because we have very little control over this, and that the effects don't last. Non-shared environmental influences are unsystematic, idiosyncratic, serendipitous events without lasting effects. The systematic, stable, and long-lasting source of who we are is DNA. So he really drives this home, and the rest of the literature echoes this. I'm quoting Plomin at length because he's sort of the most accessible source of this information, but people can dive into the literature if they're interested. So all of this is just to say that we are not frozen in time by what has happened to us, by the past events. We don't experience a traumatic event and just stay stagnant there. It's quite the contrary. We actually become who we really are over time, despite what may have happened to us. So you can derail people with traumatic events and sort of childhood adversity of all different types, and that will have an effect on what their childhood is like and how they experience their childhood and whether it's enjoyable or not. So it matters a lot. We don't want to create bad environments of abuse and trauma for children, obviously, but it doesn't, when you look over time through the twin studies and these other ways of actually controlling for these factors, it washes out. you become who you are. You essentially overwrite those traumatic events and those anything that would increase your adversity score as you go through your life. It does not stay with you forever. It does not determine who you are. Okay, so ACE scores specifically, I just want to bring up a couple of things, and I'm going to wrap up here quickly and have a couple of minutes for question. So some specific problems with ACE scores is that they're retrospective. You're asking adults who have problems as adults, did you also have issues in childhood? And this is just a notoriously inaccurate way of gathering data. And this is a quote from a sort of a critique in the UK of ACE scores. Individuals who do not see themselves as experiencing problems in adult life may not report conditions or relationships which may well have been negative, but which they see themselves as having overcome. So this is the third variable of just more robustness, more emotional stability, more resilience. You're not going to remember every little sling and arrow of childhood if you don't see yourself as having a lot of problems that would be explained by that as an adult. And at the same time, individuals who are experiencing difficulties as adults may be more inclined to recall problematic aspects of their childhood experiences. So if you're an adult who has a lot of issues, you're likely to have the kind of personality that also remembers a lot of issues in your childhood. So these are things that are being driven by that hidden variable that we talked about. The purported biological mechanisms of ACE scores and how childhood adversity remains in the body and lives in the body, these are correlational, and they're largely what we would call scientistic. These are not medical facts. They are not evidence-based. The mechanism by which any kind of adverse event in childhood or chronic adverse situation remains in the body, this is just not supported by evidence. There may be sort of short-term effects. Again, you have higher cortisol, there are things that affect your childhood experience, but they don't remain with you for life. It doesn't live in the body forever. This gets even more fanciful and scientific when people start talking about epigenetic trauma, ancestral trauma, the issues that your great grandparents had continue to live in your body. Those people they're selling you something. If somebody is telling you about your epigenetic trauma, there is no evidence-based mechanism for that. So I would want people to be very wary of that kind of language. And then the final problem with ACE scores that concerns me is the sort of medicalization of normal life and the diagnostic inflation that we see with pharmaceutical industry that is eager to dichotomize and to diagnose and to tell you that you have some sort of condition as a result of some childhood situation. When you break it down, 2/3 of the population in the United States has at least one ACE on this list. So that means 2/3 of us are sort of, diagnosable according to this framework as having we're more likely to have some kind of pathology. And that silos people into this deterministic victim mentality that is actually much more disempowering than the childhood challenges themselves are, the effects of which, as we've seen, even out and wash out over time. So for emotional eating, specifically, I just want people to really realize that it all comes down to the pleasure trap. It comes down to the food that you were eating. So I love this cartoon with the dinosaurs. I can't believe I ate all that salad for nothing. So this is the situation that we're in. We all emotionally eat. Everybody emotionally eats. You eat to feel better. That is your job as a species. That is why food, even a carrot stick, is going to create feelings of pleasure and the notion that you're doing the right thing for your survival and reproduction. That's what it's supposed to do. Food and sex is your whole job as a human, as a member of the species. Food is supposed to make you feel better. So there's nothing wrong with emotionally eating per se if you're stressed and you're having a hard time, but you can't your ancestors, no matter what kind of personality they had, no matter what kind of heritability they had for obesity, no matter what kind of conscientiousness or emotional stability they were endowed with. They could emotionally eat 24/7, but they were emotionally eating a diet that was suitable for the species, and so they would never become overweight. The problem is not us. It's not our desire to self-medicate by getting a little bit of dopamine to feel better in the moment because we're having a hard day. That is a natural process. You're supposed to be driven to do that. The problem is that you're getting into supernormal food that the species is not adapted to, and that it is hijacking your pleasure pathways and giving you false signaling about that being the right thing to do. And that is going to lead to adult adverse outcomes because of the nature of the food that you're eating, not because of what is driving you to do it, or even the act of emotionally eating itself. Okay, so some closing thoughts, because I know that people, when they hear about the hidden variable of genes and Plomin's findings and just this general course of thinking, I want to sort of contextualize it and be specific about what we're really saying here. So again, this is from Blueprint. Plomin says, DNA is the only thing that makes a substantial systematic difference. The rest comes down to chance environmental experiences that do not have long-term effects. It's not enough to show a statistically significant effect. So all these ACE studies, they'll show, they'll try to wow you by saying it's statistically significant that there's a link between childhood trauma and a certain outcome like obesity or alcoholism. But the issue is effect size. So sure, it may be statistically significant, but how much of the variance does it really explain of who you are and how likely the population is to have that outcome? It's 1 or 2%. So this is a tiny little piece of the puzzle. Heritability describes what is, but it does not predict what could be. This is one of his key phrases. High heritability of weight does not mean there's nothing you can do about your weight, nor does it mean that we must succumb to our genetic propensities to depression, learning disabilities, or alcohol abuse. Genes are not destiny. You can change, but heritability means that some people are more vulnerable to these problems and also find it more difficult to overcome them. So that's really that's what I want people to understand, is that this is empowering if you understand how it really works and you can compensate for it more effectively, rather than trying to solve the problem with the wrong information, which is the psychodynamic Freudian notion that you have become who you are because of the things that happened to you in your childhood. We want to give you the correct information so you can make the correct inferences, so you can engineer your environment appropriately to compensate for your real liabilities, not your perceived liabilities. And then finally, this is wonderful Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, where we see how it's not always a good idea to talk about genetic influence, where his mom says, "You've been hitting rocks in the house. Why on earth would you do something like that?" And Calvin very reasonably says, "Poor genetic material," and gets grounded for it. So this is the situation we find ourselves in, where the truth is very uncomfortable and we don't always want to hear it, but it is ultimately much more empowering to see the world as it is than how we kind of wish that it might be. So I will leave a few minutes for questions. If people are interested, our website is esteemdynamics.com. They can watch our Human Nature series, where we get into all of this for 4 hours, and we have lots of other content where people can totally get up to speed on all of this. So I will stop my little screen share.
Sorry, I had my mic off because I didn't want to disrupt it in any way. For me, this was amazing. But as you know, not everyone agrees. And you were at the last live Ultimate Weight Loss Conference when Dr. Lisle gave his epic talk, Not Your Trauma, Not Your Mama. And a lot of people got angry. And there are some angry people here saying things like, well, I disagree. Adverse childhood experiences and ancestral trauma continue to live in the body and affect your life.
Yeah, sure. There's plenty of literature. I mean, it's not hard to go to the literature and find evidence that supports that. But that goes back to the point that I made at the end, where there can be a relationship that can be statistically significant. And so this is what we used to call in my program stargazing, because the little stars next to the p-value, the probability of this being due to chance. And that is that yes, something can be very statistically significant, very fascinating correlation, but we really care about the effect size. We care about how much of the variance does it explain. And in the case of these things, it's a very small amount. So we want to be looking at the things that have the lion's share of the variance to give you the most empowerment and the most authority over your life trajectory that we can.
You know, I've dealt with other issues where people disagree, like whether we should eat nuts or not, that get people upset. But I don't see anything to get people this upset when you tell them that this might not be true. They get very angry and defensive, and they don't want to hear this.
Oh, I understand. I didn't want, I mean, people who don't know me and don't know my story and haven't listened to me yammer about this on the podcast, like I used to be very much in the psychodynamic, your trauma shapes you sort of paradigm, because I have, like I said, a very high ACE score, and went through some crap as a kid, and had later in life problems with food addiction, alcohol addiction, and it seemed like these things were intimately connected. I could draw all kinds of connections between them. It was very intuitive, and in my subjective experience, absolutely seemed incredibly true. So I had to be really hammered over the head with this data and come to a new understanding. But it didn't happen for me overnight. I had to really steel myself and go into it and be prepared to change my mind. But I understand that it's not easy for people to do that, and that I'm working against a lot of very strong intuition here.
Well, when Dr. Lisle explained it to me, I thought it was very empowering, actually.
Yeah, I think when you do realize what we're really dealing with, it is empowering. It just doesn't seem that way at first. It seems very deterministic, very reductionist, very like, oh, well, it's, how is it empowering to tell me that I'm, my genes are driving my ultimate, how obese I'm going to become. And it's like, no, we need to actually realize how to more effectively leverage the control that you do have. That's what we're really up to.
Well, Apple says she's angry about being dismissed as a stargazer.
Oh, okay. Well, not everybody it's the fact that you're discussing p-values in a paper doesn't make you a stargazer. It's that some papers tend to value that over actual meaningful inferences. Right. I haven't read her work, so I couldn't say for sure, but I don't mean to assume that everybody is.
And Jane says, well, how will these insights help us get thin?
It comes down to the food. That is really the whole thing. I mean, all of this background that I gave you is really just academic. It's really just to help you understand where you're starting from, and to not delude yourself by misunderstanding what it is that makes you struggle with this problem. What makes you struggle is the fact that you're eating supernormal food, that your environment has supernormal food in it. I mean, this is the same message that I think, AJ hammers home all the time. We try to hammer home all the time. Most of the guests on the show, that it really, if you were eating a food that is natural, a diet that is natural for the species, a Stone Age compliant diet, you are not going to struggle with issues of being overweight or obese. It's just not going to happen. But the sort of ability to control your environment is also heritable. The level of conscientiousness that you have is heritable. The level of emotional stability and your tendency to self-medicate is heritable. So understanding where you fit in and how disproportionately vulnerable you are because of your genetic predisposition can be an empowering way to understand, okay, well, I'm less conscientious than average, and that makes it harder for me to control my environment because I'm just more indulgent. I'm more sort of spontaneously likely to stop by the pizza shop and get some pizza. That means I need to enforce some more draconian measures on controlling my environment than somebody else might need to. You need to think outside the box to solve the problems based on who it is that you really are, not who it is that you think you could have been if not for the things that happened to you.
I think because you and I had the benefit of spending so much time at TrueNorth, we've seen people with terrible stress and terrible trauma that still lost weight.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, this goes back to the sort of the PTSD example, where there is no uniform outcome across the population with how likely someone is to exhibit PTSD based on any specific trauma. This is all being mediated by personality, by genetic characteristics that are beyond your control.
Thank you. Jay says, does emotional eating have anything to do with physical, mental, social, relational, or sexual needs not being met?
So you were going to, as an animal that is seeking signals that you were doing the correct thing for survival and reproduction, seeking food is always a good bet. as an animal in nature. So you have made these correlational analyses over time that okay, when I'm feeling bad for any reason, you know, I had a hard day at work, or my spouse is upset with me, or I am not meeting some goal in life, that is essentially the nervous system is crying out for some signaling that you're getting back on track to do the right thing to make yourself more competitive and successful in the derby, the evolutionary derby of life. And the main way that we are able to get those signals that we're doing something that is bringing us back on track for evolutionary success is to get a little hit of dopamine from somewhere. This is how we have been built by nature. Dopamine is the guiding mechanism to let us know if we're doing the right thing or not. So anytime that you're distressed, you're going to be more inclined to seek out a signal that okay, how can I feel better? So of course you're gonna seek out sex and food. That's your job. That's what you do. And when you are exposed to, or you're in an environment that includes super normal food, that is so much more bang for your buck in terms of the feelings of success, of evolutionary success that it's going to give you, than something like a carrot stick. So yes, you're going to emotionally eat when you're stressed, when you're having a hard time, when your feeling needs aren't being met. But again, this goes back to the point. If it's not super normal food, there's no problem. Emotionally eat all day. Emotionally eat all you want. You're supposed to eat when you feel bad. That's how we're built. But you're not supposed to eat cupcakes and pizza and Twinkies and everything else that people will get into. That's like not part of our history.
Yep. Susan says, well, what about the evidence that severe physical abuse causes changes in the brain?
So those are, again, these are observational correlational studies, because people are not looking at the brain before, because you can't do a controlled study where you essentially have a severe trauma treatment of the test group. That would be totally unethical. So these are just observational studies where it seems like people who have experienced this kind of severe trauma seem to have, there is a relationship between different patterns in the brain imaging. But do we know that changed as a result of the trauma? Or is there, again, that third variable that makes the trauma more likely and that, creates the sort of brain imaging that we see later on? So that's an emerging part of the science that has not been, there's some evidence about that, but because it's so difficult to study and it's so difficult to control for, it's a little less robust. But it seems, based on all of the other literature that we can control for, and there is some with the twin studies, because you do have a built-in control group when you have certain twins that experience extreme trauma and others that don't. And you can see that the brain differences are not significant. So this is all an emerging science, but I just want people to kind of think about these things more critically and get away from that very intuitive, correlational, observational way of putting the world together and having these defeatist notions about what it means for struggling with the issues that you're struggling with as an adult.
Great. Michelle says, how does chronic high cortisol due to stress impact us?
So lots of different ways, and I'm not an expert on that particular topic. So again, I just want to sort of have the caveat that I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a psychologist. What I do know about that question is that, yes, we can see that the sort of a stressful event or a stressful environment for a child, for example, will lead to an increase at that time of high cortisol, but it doesn't have that long-term change to the brain over time when we break it down and look at the twin studies. So the fact that it has an effect in the moment and that it is very intuitive leads to this kind of thinking. But you have to stand back and really ask yourself, am I missing something? Am I looking through am I looking at this question through a lens that is not considering a genetic factor? If that is the case, then maybe it deserves a second look.
There's some guy on that's stalking you named Michael Greger or something.
That guy.
And I don't know who he is. He says he has a chapter on stress and cortisol in his book, How Not to Diet.
There you go. Of course,
terrific.
Great. Probably some videos too.
Yeah. I don't know if I should ask this, so I'll ask it and then you don't have to answer it. But Kat says, well, how do you feel about reparation for slaves? I guess maybe that has.
Oh boy, that's a whole other, that's a totally different topic. So
okay, so we'll come back up to that one for next time you come on. And so I guess this is a question a lot of people have. If Florence says, okay, so can we have a few practical tips to that we can take to move on from our past?
Yeah, just the sort of empowerment that it does not permanently shape who you are. So it's the attachment that you have to the things that happen to you is because because of this strong intuitive notion that, of course, something that's significant that happened is going to have this long-term causal effect. So recognizing that it does not is really the first piece of moving on from it. So recognizing that, yeah, that was then, this is now, here I am, I have certain genetic propensities and liabilities and issues. Let me look at them very squarely and really assess who I really am, where my strengths are, where my weaknesses are, and design an environment that accounts for those things, not an environment that I hope that I can make work for me based on some notion of who I might be if I could just overcome my traumas, but in an environment that really honestly confronts the things that are more difficult for you because of who it is that you are, not because of who you were made into by what happened to you. So it's all the same advice that we are always giving people, but different people need to be differentially creative about what kind of environmental solutions they come up with that are suitable for their personality and just for how much they're going to struggle with this, because not everybody struggles in the same way or to the same degree. And that is because of genetic influences, not because of past events.
Anyway, I don't know if you can see the comments, Dr. Howk, but they're largely just people love you. You're brilliant. And, I listen to you and Dr. Lisle like I'm a groupie. Like, you don't know this, but like before we came out, I'm just always listening to something of yours over and over again. And I say that because I think I just had an epiphany, and I hope I'm right. But
good.
As I was listening to this, I'm thinking, and this is based on the work that you guys do you think that a lot of people are really attached to this trauma theory because it keeps them out of the ego trap? So it's sort of like saying, well, I would lose weight, but I can't because I had this bad thing happen.
Yeah, sure. But that could be its own form of the ego trap. It's sort of the ego trap, for people who are not familiar, is sort of it's shorthand for creative competitive avoidance. It's for the situation where you are looking at something that you in principle would want to solve a problem to make yourself more successful competitively in the quote Stone Age village in an evolutionary sense. So losing weight is one of those things. Most people infer if they lose weight, get healthy, that they're going to be more attractive. They're going to attract a better quality of mate. They're going to get a better job. They're going to have friends that, better friends that like them more. That is what motivates us to do it. So anytime that people look at some kind of problem and they've tried to solve it and they're getting some evidence that it's not going to be so easy to solve and maybe they can't do it. And so often losing weight is one of these things. People have tried and tried and tried and failed and slipped and just can't do it. The tendency to come up with ways to avoid putting yourself into the competitive fray gets very, very strong. And so if I can say, oh, well, I really would solve this if I could, but I had all these terrible things that happened to me, which derailed me from those efforts, that can be definitely a form of avoiding the fact that this is just an incredibly difficult problem to solve, and we never evolved to solve it. People need to just forgive themselves and have some self-compassion for the fact that this is not something you're supposed to be able to figure out. We did not evolve in a context of supernormal food, and it's no bearing upon how decent a person you are, whether you can solve the pleasure trap problem or not. Nobody is supposed to be able to solve it. Your pleasure pathways have been completely hijacked by these supernormal foods. So really just having that forgiveness and that self-compassion and like, okay, this is supposed to be freaking hard and I'm having a harder problem than a lot of people trying to solve it. How can I deal with that on the effect side, not the causal side? Like the whatever happened to you in your past, it may have been very negative. We wish that it didn't happen that way, but it is not making it harder for you to solve the pleasure trap in this moment. That is its own problem that is completely a function of the supernormal food environment, has nothing to do with what you may have experienced or didn't experience in your childhood or at any point in your life.
Well, I couldn't have said it better. This was just mind blowing. This was conference worthy. Seriously, like if I was still producing conferences, this is.
I don't have any cartoons. I'm not the artist that Dr. Lisle is. So if we do it at a conference at some time, I'll have to get him to add some artistic value.
Well, Pam is saying one of your best talks to date. I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much for doing this. This was just mind blowing. And this is something that we'll all have to probably listen to again.
Sounds good. And I'm happy to come back and clarify. And I know people are going to have all kinds of questions, and they're welcome to find us on our website, esteemdynamics.com, and sign up for the library, the Living Wisdom Library, for $3 a month to have full access to all of our ranting about this and everything else.
Yeah, because I was listening to a couple of new things that are under the members library, and they're fantastic. So thank you so much. I so appreciate that you come on and do this either with yourself or Dr. Lisle or Dr. Gregor. Now that's like a whole nother.
We got a whole pack here in Maui. So yes, yeah,
you are
great to see you.
You're literally the smartest girl I know.
Oh, thanks, AJ. I appreciate that.
No, really. I'm just so impressed by you. And thank you so much for doing this. And I look forward to next month.
Sweet.
And I think you're coming on with Dr. Lisle next month. So that's always fun as well.
I believe so. Yeah. Mid-September. So yep. Sounds good.
And don't forget to listen to Dr. Lisle and Dr. Hawk, sometimes together, sometimes separately, every Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. Pacific time for Beat Your Genes podcast. There's like over 250 episodes right now.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care.